The Czech Republic is widely recognized for having really good zoos. However, the zoo in Ústí nad Labem is probably rarely mentioned when it comes to the best zoos in the country. Though at 26 hectares, it has a large and very beautiful park area where you can discover numerous and sometimes rare animal species. And since it's also very easily accessible even by train from Prague or Dresden, there could be a good reason to plan a visit here, especially as we can also talk about a very ambitious master plan for the future in this video. The zoo is around 20 minutes walk from the main railway station and welcomes you with its stylish administration building. Right next to the building is the first small highlight, the seal enclosure. However, even though the enclosure with its artificial rocks and the view of the administration building behind it is quite impressive, there is definitely room for improvement here due to the lack of natural substrates on the one hand and the lack of an underwater view on the other. In addition to numerous information boards, there are also aviaries next to the outer wall of the zoo, in which, as far as I have seen, mainly Australian birds live. This, for example, is a blue-faced honey-eater. Behind the seal enclosure, the path continues to the small Primate Pavilion, which was opened in 2001. There used to be orangutans here. If we would have visited a little bit earlier in April of 2024, we would have seen the last one, Ferda, born in Frankfurt Zoo, the oldest male orangutan in Europe at the age of 54 before he passed away. In the future, there are plans to reintroduce orangutans to Ústí, but fortunately no longer in this enclosure, which was not even up to date back when it opened. Instead of orangutans, I was able to discover red-footed tortoises in the indoor enclosure, and on the other side, where you can also enter the house, the Brazos monkeys were waiting for us, and even for them I still think this is a rather mediocre enclosure, and we will soon realize that monkey husbandry is one of the most urgent areas in need of revision here. The only other animals currently living in the house are northern Luzon giant cloud rats, as well as the northern tree shrews, which live together and at least have a small outdoor cage. Fortunately, I have a lot less to complain when it comes to the penguin enclosure. It was previously inhabited by sea lions and was redesigned for the penguins in 2017. In contrast to the harbor seals, the African penguins can also be observed underwater here, at least in theory. In our case, however, they stayed in the upper part of the enclosure, as the entire enclosure is built into a slope and can also be viewed from a viewing platform at the top. Next door, a group of small-clawed otters played in their enclosure, which also benefits from its location on the slope, the watercourse included. Admittedly, I found the enclosure here a little narrow, but as you can see, the otters seemed to be quite lively and happy. The beautiful outdoor enclosure for the pygmy hippo, on the other hand, remained deserted, as the animal apparently wanted to spend the whole day in its indoor area. Fortunately, the indoor enclosure is visible through a glass pane, so I was still able to enjoy the sight of a pygmy hippo and also check out the indoor enclosure, which I found to be quite well equipped as well. Higher up on the slope, there are also enclosures for cranes and muntjacs, and here on this enclosure there used to be flamingos, but after a remodeling some ducks can now be seen here. This, on the other hand, is actually an outdoor enclosure for alligators, but unfortunately they still weren't allowed outside when we visited. But we were lucky enough to be able to visit the new kangaroo enclosure shortly after it opened, and yes, as you can see, the enclosure is accessible for visitors as well. Eastern grey kangaroos and dusky petamelons live here in a really beautiful enclosure, which is of course also located on a slope. But even here in the background, the monkey enclosures behind it didn't look particularly inviting. The whole area dates back to 1989, the year I was born, so at the risk of a midlife crisis on my part, it already got a few years under its belt, and you can see that. Gibbons, mandrills, and the relatively rarely kept East Javan langurs live here in really bland and old-fashioned enclosures. There were probably even more species living here in the past, and at least some of the areas for the animals have been merged, but of course the staff in Ústí are already aware that these are no longer modern husbandry conditions. The first step will be to move the gibbons to another enclosure, which we will come to later. In the long term, however, this whole area here is to be demolished as part of the master plan. In this respect, I have to admit that I found it quite interesting from a historical perspective to be able to see the facilities here as they are now. But at the same time, I am of course very excited about the further development of the park, and it really can't come quickly enough for these animals. There are also some very old-fashioned aviaries here, but we can fortunately leave what is probably the worst part of the zoo behind us now. We continue up the slope past an enclosure for lowland anoas, an endemic species of buffalo on the islands of Sulawesi and Buton, and then we pass an empty enclosure for red pandas. However, I was able to discover the panda only a little further in another enclosure, where it had probably been temporarily housed due to the broken glass at his actual enclosure. But I shouldn't skip this dark enclosure, where it's unfortunately also very difficult to see through the bars, but I was still able to spot a Jeffrey's cat here. A little foretaste of the big cats we'll get to in a moment. But first we are off to the Exotarium. Unfortunately, the reptile area on the lower floor was closed during our visit, and there was little to see in the outdoor cages of the building, which was built in 1977. But once inside, a variety of exciting animal species awaited us, starting with various marmosets, such as the right-lipped tamarins, red-handed tamarins, and golden lion tamarins. The sloth once again lived up to its name, while the red-banded armadillo was busy on the ground, and the rock cavies were nibbling on the fresh greenery. And when I add Brazilian porcupines and white-faced sakis to the list, you might get the impression that the animals here are all from South America, but the Sumatran Prevost squirrels already have the contradiction in their name, just like the Sulawesi beer couscous, which accordingly also comes from Asia and is probably the rarest animal here at the zoo. Otherwise, they can only be seen throughout Europe in Paradisa and Berlin Tierpark. However, this could change in the future due to the breeding success in Berlin. One of the young males from Berlin now also lives here in Ústí, and maybe it will also work out with the offsprings here, so that there may soon be more than 8 individuals throughout Europe. But that's still not it, because fortunately there are also at least a few reptiles and amphibians to see on this floor, so we didn't go away completely empty-handed. Unsurprisingly, given the year of construction, the building looks a little old-fashioned, but the conditions in which the animals are kept here are at least okay for the most part in my opinion, even if the outdoor area of the sakis was temporarily blocked by the aforementioned red panda. Right next door is the predator area, where there are also some exciting species to see. This enclosure is home to sun bears, for example, although we encountered them in their indoor enclosures. I have to admit, I always forget how rare it is to see sun bears these days, as there are only 15 facilities left in Europe that have them. And in the Czech Republic they can otherwise only be seen in Jihlava, and since we also already went there, that means we have seen all of them. Snow leopards are much more common in European zoos, but nonetheless I was delighted to see them again, especially as I was able to capture footage like this indoors indoors, only to also capture them active outside later. And the tigers were also very photogenic outside. And while tigers in general are certainly not a great rarity in European zoos, Malayan tigers in particular are, as the European breeding program has concentrated on Siberian and Sumatran tigers. The last Malayan tigers are slowly disappearing from European zoos. Currently, they are only remaining in 7 facilities. And in Ústí too, one of the tigers had to be put down after our visit, so that only one remains here. And Katanga lions can no longer be seen in Ústí at all, because the last remaining male, Leon, who was born in Halle Zoo, had to be put down at an advanced age. As a result, the entire predator area, which was originally built in 1980 but also renovated in 2005, is now facing a major overhaul. Nevertheless, I have decided to simply say how I rate the area as I have seen it. And mediocre is a very accurate categorization then, because I do think they have certainly managed to get something good out of a building that is now 45 years old. On the one hand, this is true in purely visual terms, thanks to these murals and above all the design of the interior areas. That doesn't do much for the animals, but it's certainly been beautifully improved for the visitors. But the outdoor enclosures in particular have certainly been optimized for the animals as well. I was least convinced by the tiger outdoor enclosures for reasons of space alone, but I can praise the now former lion enclosure, for example, for not having a water ditch but a dry moat that therefore effectively also could be used by the animals. My biggest criticism, however, is that there were not enough outdoor enclosures, so that in the event of separation, which is certainly necessary for many of these species from time to time, some of the animals would have to stay inside. Depending on how the old lion enclosure is used now, this affects both the sun bears and the snow leopards. However, I later saw that they could at least be outside together during our visit. And so we can almost move on now, but for the sake of completeness, it should also be mentioned that the meerkats can also be found here. From here, the path leads even further up the slope, so you definitely have to be prepared to cover a few meters in altitude here. But you will be rewarded for this. Firstly, because the park and enclosures here are much more spacious and close to nature. And secondly, the higher part of the zoo also offers a really beautiful view, which then provides a really great backdrop, for example, as here with the zebras. In this part of the zoo, there are numerous of enclosures for hooved animals, such as Somali wild asses, still not used to that, and llamas, but there is also an enclosure for collared peccaries. And I have to emphasize once again that after the zoo and the enclosures up to this point had come across more like a classic and rather old-fashioned zoo, I was really impressed by the spacious and natural enclosures here. And even if the view of the city with its large panel system buildings is perhaps not particularly stunning here, I thought the view of the fog-covered mountains around it was really wonderful and atmospheric. But of course, I was even happier about this sight. 4 young cheetahs who were kind enough to stay right next to the fence, although they could certainly have hidden in their large enclosure without any problems. And so we have finally arrived at the highest area of the zoo, where you will find this enormous enclosure for Indian black bucks, where in the near future the gibbons will also find their home. There are also plans for Eis to move in here, and that would mean that next to Berlin Tierpark and Frankfurt Zoo, Ústí would probably complete a trio of facilities where you can find them on European mainland right now. That would be a minor sensation. There is also another cheetah enclosure up here, which is important for breeding, and behind it we discovered a vulture in an aviary, but we didn't find a way to get there. Opposite is the enclosure for Przewalski's horses, where this ditch might already give away that elephants used to live here. Or to be more precise, at the end there was only one singular elephant cow named Deli, which was transported to the sanctuary Elephant Haven in France in 2022. With the Przewalski's horses, suitable new residents have been found, which is also true for the old elephant house, which we will come to in a moment. But first I would like to come back to the master plan, which also envisions the return of the elephants. As you can already see from this animation, there are going to be really large enclosures where the Asian elephants will live together with other species, and the zoo is going to be extended quite a bit for these new enclosures as well. At the same time, however, this African savanna enclosure also has to make way. Watusi cattle and ostriches currently live here in a separable front enclosure where rhinos used to live, while I was able to spot water bugs and blessboks in the distance in the rear enclosure, and there are also giraffes here. If I understood everything correctly, they are to leave the zoo completely in the future. Unfortunately, the master plan that you can find on the website is really microscopic, so I can't really give you a guarantee. In any case, the African enclosures in their current form would not be too much of a loss, even if they seem quite acceptable for the animals, at least on the outside. But from a visitor's point of view, the enclosures are simply designed to be a little boring, even if at least a little atmosphere has been created around them. This is followed by a small playground and a very nicely designed farm animal area, and from here we walk around this large meadow area to the former elephant house. This enclosure is home to Visayan warty pigs and Indian hog deers, which did not even have a sign yet when we visited. And if you looked closely, you might have spotted the Malayan tapir already. And so we enter the former elephant house, which was originally built in 2004, but has now been redesigned a little since the elephants left. And yes, the tapir is here the elephant's next tenant, and for a tapir I really like this enclosure. But what do you think? It's a lovely indoor area, isn't it? And as you can see, we were even lucky enough to catch the Malayan tapir diving later on. There is also another pool opposite, which also has an underwater view, so that the pig-nosed turtle or this red-bellied short-necked turtle can of course be observed wonderfully here. But the Asian Forest Pavilion, as it's now called, has even more to offer. For example, there are crowned pigeons, crested partridges, Luzon bleeding hearts, and Java sparrows. And then there are flying foxes, which were hanging in a holding cage, at least during our visit. So I think it's fair to say that the building certainly lives up to its new name. And now, of course, we have to go down the whole slope again, although it is a little bit more densely wooded on this side. Here we first come across lemurs, and while the black and white ruffed lemurs still live in a relatively small aviary, there is a large lemur enclosure opposite, which dates back to 2014 and, according to the website, was built on a former mini golf course. Ring-tailed, white-fronted and red-bellied lemurs live here, and as you may have already realized, the enclosure is actually accessible for visitors, but only in the summer months, at weekends or during holidays. Further and further down the slope is the very interestingly designed playground and this really extensive Thorolds deer enclosure, which once again impresses with its view. And now it's getting truly wildly romantic, because this building, the so-called Heinrich's Castle, really has stood the test of time. It was built by Heinrich Lumpe, after whom it is named, who originally founded a nature and bird conservation park here, which then became known as the Lumpe Park and is the predecessor of the Zoo Ústí nad Labem. Since 2008, the 100th anniversary of the park, there has also been a so-called Lumpe educational trail, where you can find out about the history of the park on signs, some of which are now quite weathered already. And that leaves us only with this wolverine enclosure, where the animals unfortunately didn't show themselves. So we can come straight to the conclusion, which is not at all easy for me, because of course this zoo definitely still has some legacy issues, especially the monkey area, and in the end there is very little here that is really ultra modern and nothing groundbreaking at all. But apart from the monkeys, who are now the first to benefit from the ambitious plan, the standard for animal husbandry here is anything but catastrophic, and for the most part quite alright, in some cases even really good, in the large hooved animals enclosures for example, and that's why I was able to enjoy the wild romantic side of the park, even with things like the remains of old enclosures. And I generally think that the extensive park grounds on the hillside with the view are one of the park's greatest strength, alongside the still super exciting animal collection, even if there are no more elephants or orangutans to be seen here. So while I can't recommend everyone to visit the Zoo of Ústí nad Labem at all costs, no matter how far away it is, if you are ever in this area, you won't go wrong here. For me, it's a rock-solid zoo that has a lot of potential. But please let me know what you think in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'm also happy to get a thumbs up if you liked this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There are still a lot of videos from zoos in the Czech Republic left, namely Pilsen, Chomutov and Děčín, but there are already plans to visit a few more this year. So you can also let me know which other zoos in the Czech Republic or maybe even Poland I definitely need to check out. And with that being said, thank you for your attention. Decui moc, or as we say in German, Wiederschauen reingehauen. Yours truly, Martin.